Hi, my name is Dr. Nafhesa Ali. I'm a lecturer in sociology in the Department of Social Sciences at Northumbria University in Newcastle in the United Kingdom. So I'm both a lecturer and interdisciplinary researcher, and my work focuses on the everyday lives of racialized and minority groups. And the themes that I'm interested in researching include social gerontology, Muslim sexualities, environmental sustainability, and qualitative research methods. So this presentation aims to explore intersectionality, identity, and social inequality. So today we're going to look at why intersectionality was situated as a radical idea, to look at intersectionality as a critical framework for exploring and analysing contemporary issues in society, and to recognise how multiple intersections intersect and shape identities, both subjective and collective. By the end of the presentation, we will understand intersectionality and its framework and application, be able to apply intersectionality in critical discussions of identity and behaviour in contemporary society, and gain knowledge in how to extend understandings of intersectionality and how it can be mobilised in, for example, social policy, and the uses and the challenges and benefits of it as a framework. Critical race theory emerged in the 1980s and 90s amongst a group of legal scholars in response to what seemed to Kimberly Crenshaw and her colleagues like a false consensus, that discrimination and racism in law were irrational, and that once the irrational distortions of bias were removed, the underlying legal and socio-economic order would revert to a neutral, benign state of impersonally apportioned justice. Crenshaw argued that this was a delusion that was as comforting as it was dangerous. In the US, racism didn't just stop in 1965 with the passage of the Civil Rights Act. It wasn't just a blip in the nation's history that the law would and could make go away through legalization and create an aura of safety for persons of color. The reality is that the US American legal and socio-economic order was largely built on racism and white supremacy. Crenshaw's theory of intersectionality was first brought into the public eye in 1989, when she published a paper titled Demarginalizing the Intersection of Race and Sex. The paper centers on 3 legal cases that dealt with the issues of both racial discrimination and sex discrimination, and argued that the court's narrow view of discrimination was a prime example of the law seeming to forget and neglect the reality that Black women are both Black and female, and thus subject to discrimination based on both race and gender, but was also often a combination of the two. This was on full display in the 1976 court case De Graaf and General Motors, in which 5 Black women sued General Motors for seniority policy that they argued targeted Black women exclusively. Simply put, General Motors did not hire Black women before 1964. This meant that the seniority-based layoffs arrived during an early 1970s recession, and all the Black women hired after 1964 were subsequently laid off. While it's obvious on paper that policy like that didn't fall under the Gender or Just Race Discrimination Acts, but both, the court decided that efforts to bind together both racial discrimination and sex discrimination claims, rather than sue based on each separately, would be unworkable. Crenshaw's theory is now mainstream, and over the last few decades, the theory of intersectionality has been expanded to include categories of identity, but maintains a basis in race. So let's look at this more closely. To understand intersectionality, we need to recognize that before intersectionality, race, gender, and class, these categories were categories in their own right. They were constructed as master categories, separated and known as single axes, which created add-ons and not intersections. So the issues with master categories and separations suggest that everything has one place, a meaning only in relation to other places, and every place has its rank. So Hill-Collins suggests that this separation creates hierarchies, and these hierarchies underpin racism, sexism, heterosexism, nationalism, colonialism, and similar structures of power. Also, these boundaries of separation are telling of how power is exercised in deciding who gets to do intellectual work in the first place. Challenging oppressions with distinct categories means that you only tackle one issue at a time. Single axis boundary making creates separation and spaces of how power is exercised. When the number of categories are looked at separately, this is not enough, and we must look at their overlapping intersections. Kimberly Crenshaw, in her paper Mapping the Margins, argues that anti-racist and feminist movements were overlooking the experience of black women. Race was understood to protect black men and feminism was to protect white women. Combining them together as add-on did not help to protect black women. So it was only an issue with the categories, but it was also an issue with the structures and institutional discourses that sometimes reified existing power relations that produced and legitimized power relations. There were additional intersections at play, and there was a need to understand privilege and power through our interconnected intersections and how the interplay of multiple intersections add to the experience of oppression. For example, race and gender, but that also includes ageism, sexism, across these multiple intersections and others. Intersectionality then allows you to understand each unique oppression, but also how they change in combination. Intersectionality also allows you to look at our own privileges and who may be excluded as a result of our own intersections and our ways of knowing or being in the world. So Patricia Hill Collins argues that the challenges are that there is no standard definition of intersectionality, but that most people categorize it in the following ways. First, intersectionality as intersectional differences such as class, gender, age, etc. Second, structures of social inequalities that are constructed within these intersections. Third, how social actors are situated within power relations due to their historical or social context. And four, because of these locations within these intersections and their related oppressions, they have distinctive standpoints. As intersectionality looks at multiple systematic oppressions that are at play, it can then be useful, as intersectional identities are often applied by people who have privilege due to their own identities. Identities thus gives them the space to equate their own identities but ignore the systematic oppressions that are at play, which leads to Oppression Olympics, where two people equate their experiences as the same. People who participate in Oppression Olympics tend to ignore that multiple people can experience oppression, not just one over the other, for example. This is and can be dangerous and can conflict due to confusing intersectionality and intersectional identities. Oppression Olympics is a term used when two or more groups compete to prove themselves as more oppressed than the other. Competing in the Oppression Olympics attaches something like a moral dimension to oppression, whose oppression is worthier. So people who participate in Oppression Olympics tend to ignore the fact that it's possible for multiple groups to be oppressed and necessarily how important it is to address all those problems. To help us understand intersectionality, we must understand that intersectionality sits in critical inquiry that reflects feminist theory and anti-racist politics and was first introduced by Kimberly Crenshaw in 1989. It originates from a black feminist critique that highlighted the issues and problems of having single-axis frameworks for the examination of categories such as gender and race. Crenshaw, in a 1989 paper demarginalizing the intersection of race and sex, argued that this previously used single-axis framework where gender or race had been examined through individual master categories was problematic, and it erased the experiences of black women in the conceptualization, identification, and remediation of race and sex discrimination. She claimed that feminist theory lacked value for black women as it evolved from a white racial context which is seldom acknowledged, and as a result created privilege which continued to marginalize the experiences of minority groups, communities, and individuals. How they were positioned in the world and in relation to their subjective experiences, such as through ways of knowing and doing, but also how divisions of power and resistance came about as a result. Patricia Hill Collins, in a 2019 book, Intersectionality as Social Critical Theory, revisits this framework and adds that the deeply entrenched social inequalities would not disappear overnight, nor would the social problems that they engendered, which she notes were a result of colonialism, racism, sexism, and nationalism. As you can see here, there are a number of suffixes that are isms and represent words specific to a practice, system, or philosophy, in which these practices, systems, or philosophies in this case represent political ideologies or relate to a belief system as accepted by a social group or school of thought. The suffix is always added to a noun. Yet the interconnectedness of these social problems, Hill Collins notes, provided new possibilities for social change, as it addresses critical inquiry, power and resistance, relationality, social change, challenges and social inequalities, ways of knowing and being, social justice, and social change. These categories and boundaries of single categories become blurred when added to one another, so as one category can change when another is added. Therefore, the multiple forces and social identities in which power and disadvantage are expressed can be explored and critiqued. Creating your own intersecting circles is a useful way to see how we understand our own position in the world and how we construct our identities, whether this includes single or multiple intersecting identities and circles. Once you have done this, it's useful to ask why you chose your two primary circles. Did anything surprise you with your circle? And which of your identity circle do you feel has caused you the most oppression or hardship? And why do you feel this? Did anything surprise you with your circles? And which of your identity circles do you feel has caused you the most advantage? Intersecting identities is a concept that an individual identity consists of multiple intersecting factors, including but not limited to gender identity, gender expression, race, ethnicity, class, past and present, religious beliefs, sexual identity, sexual expression. These intersecting factors are what makes us multi-layered individuals. Each aspect of our identities influence the other aspects of our identities to show who we are. In this concept, there is an emphasis on identity being fluid and shifting throughout one's life. Very few theories have looked at the interdisciplinary and global nature of intersectionality. Intersectionality's movement in the international arena draws attention to how contextual differences generate different engagements with the theory. Caribbean feminists, for example, have deployed intersectionality to examine historical relations and nation building outside of the metropole. By doing this, they draw attention to alternate ways of conceptualizing intersectionality and intersectional subjects. Here, the global dimension of history and power are key. See Cabado et al. 2013 in their paper Intersectionality Mapping the Movements of a Theory. This includes global, transnational, international experiences, and including these into intersectionality, which enriches the framework. So understanding that intersectionality and recognizing that additive frameworks are interconnected is no longer novel. Intersectionality and relationality are not a new phenomenon, and they lie in the heart of a theoretical analysis of social inequality. This may seem simple, but it can disrupt taken for granted knowledge. So they're useful particularly when added to bodies of knowledge created by communities where additive strategies can take on a different meaning. So where relationality disrupts logic of segregation that underlies Western knowledge. For intersectional practitioners, relational thinking through addition is a useful tool that lends itself to different uses. It allows you to recognize the absence of race, gender, sexuality, and similar categories, in particular in the study, but also in the practice or theory. So Hill-Collins adds that relationality and relational thinking of any kind is not just a small task, but rather challenges the categorical logic that underpins Western epistemology. This has been critiqued, but this also applies to categorical thinking that is separated into fields which benefit multidisciplinary work, for example, distinguishing between science and humanities, and thus maintaining segregated spaces and boundaries. Hill-Collins highlights how traditional family ideals function as privileged exemplar of intersectionality. And this includes imagined traditional ideals such as family, which is constructed with bonds of love and care, sexual division of labour, women and men's roles in the home. And the critique here is that this is based on heterosexual attraction and traditional family structures, where space creates the ideological construction and serves as a fundamental principle for social organisation. Examining intersectionality at a household level can counter stereotypes and look at the ways in which social hierarchies are constructed, but also the way in which they have wider significance to the representation for those who are sidelined or marginalised. So how do we critically understand intersectionality? So this includes multiple identities, ones that mutually construct one another, areas of difference and similarity, multiple oppressions and experiences within this context. We can also use power and privilege to understand intersectionality, and this includes reflecting on our own privileges and how this may create powers and spaces of privilege, and how we can actively intersect and engage with others. This includes who is excluded and included in the conversation, but also taking action to include others whose voices may be excluded. The radical intersectionality requires constant critical inquiry and praxis centered on power, including how we shape power and how power shapes us. The logics of intersectionality are essential. We can exist in both oppressive and liberatory systems simultaneously. We need to reflect and challenge this to achieve intersectionality's transformative potential. So ways of doing intersectionality moves towards acknowledging the issues, limitations, and potential replication of the status quo. So we can do this through our own personal reflections on our journeys with intersectionality in hopes of contributing to radical transformation of ourselves, our disciplines, our social issues, and the world. So this includes engaging in the important terms of intersectionality, oppression, and social justice. So for example, intersectional sexualities. Looking at this can allow us to challenge stereotypes, look at controversial topics, and engage with marginalized groups and their experiences. So these experiences have a threefold significance for those who are telling them, for their communities, and for the wider societies in which they live. Ken Plummer argues that whatever else the story is, it's simply not the lived life. It speaks all around life. It provides routes into a life, lays down maps for lives to follow, and suggests links between a life and a culture. So there's a lot going on when young people, particularly young Muslims, speak about sex and relationships. To paraphrase Plummer, they are speaking about their lives and suggesting links between a life and a culture. And therefore, even the experience of love and desire, but also hopes and dreams of what they would like their relationship to be like, can be telling of how their multiple intersections are at play. So now we'll look at intersectionality and its application for social policy. The intersectional approach does not give higher status to any one inequality or experience or discrimination. Policymakers have looked to consider power dynamics and also their own experiences and influence when making decisions, but this needs to be done more. Evidence should be put into context using historical and contemporary structures of inequalities in wider society, but also within local context. So currently, in Scotland, there is a lack of intersectional data on outcomes and policy making that rarely takes an intersectional approach. And where an intersectional approach has been attempted, this could be developed further. The Scottish Government, using intersectionality to understand structural inequality in Scotland report, highlighted that a one-size-fits-all approach to narrowing inequality leaves people behind, especially where multiple inequalities intersect. Too often, a dilution or misappropriation of intersectionality is used which attempts to work for everyone, and as a consequence ignores the specific and nuanced experiences of discriminations at the intersections of inequalities. So this report concluded that there were 5 key considerations which policymakers and analysts should take into account when taking an intersectional approach. Consideration 1 was contextualization, that when taking an intersectional approach, policymaking and analysis should consider taking an account of combinations of characteristics that shape experiences. And these intersecting identities should be contextualized and understood within the systems and structures of power. And this should be central to the ways in which policies are designed, implemented, evaluated, and to ensure that those with lived experiences are taken into account. Consideration 2, reflexivity. In order to take an intersectional approach, policymakers and analysts should regularly consider their own membership of interconnected categories and practice reflexivity. This will allow them to better understand how their own power and lived experience impacts on the research and/or policy-making process. Consideration 3, public involvement, highlights that when used sincerely and applied inclusively, it can help address the power imbalance between decision-makers such as policymakers, analysts, and marginalized groups. Participatory approaches to research ensure that with the lived experience of intersecting identities, can have a central voice in the development, implementation, and evaluation of policies, while traditionally more common in qualitative research, efforts to redistribute power can also be made in quantitative research through, for example, involving community members throughout the research process, from the conceptualization through data gathering and dissemination. Consideration 4 is reaching marginalized groups. Analysts should ensure that marginalized groups are reached by reducing the barriers to their participation. This involves, for example, ensuring venues are fully accessible and suitably located, translations are provided where necessary, and using trusted mediators where necessary, but also providing incentives and reimbursements to contributors in exchange for their input. Consideration 5, statistical approaches, discusses and demonstrates that no one method fits all. An analyst should consider a range of options for carrying out intersectional data analysis, taking account of and setting out the advantages and disadvantages of techniques ahead of data collection, in addition to an assessment of the sampling approach and likely sample size that could determine which techniques are most appropriate. So to summarize, intersectionality may be constructed as a radical idea, but it can examine a number of forms of intersections that may be active at the same time. It's useful to look at understandings of social relationships through intersecting forms of discrimination. It explores the complexity of social systems in the context of the individual, family, and society. But also it's a useful tool when looking at how intersectionality can be used in social policy applications.